The events that led to World War II can be easily traced. During the 1930s, the Axis powers, Imperial Japan, Fascist Italy, and especially Germany under Adolf Hitler, challenged the rest of the world in a series of aggressive conquests. Great Britain and France, the leading European powers, tolerated this aggression, hoping to avoid a confrontation. The United States had decided after World War I to remain aloof from European squabbles. The Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Germany in 1939, hoping to avoid a war on its own soil, after having failed to persuade the Western democracies, particularly Britain and France, to form an alliance against fascism.
Despite these attempts to avoid confrontation, Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939 finally convinced Britain and France that Hitler had to be stopped. The Soviet Union entered the war in June 1941, when German troops invaded the USSR in violation of the Non-Aggression Pact. The United States entered the war in December 1941, when Japanese planes bombed American ships and airfields at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii.
This sequence of events describes how the war started, but it leaves many important questions unanswered. How did such brutal dictatorships come to power in Germany, Italy, and Japan? Why did the Axis powers undertake so many aggressive acts? And why did the rest of the world wait until only a world war could stop the Axis? World War II started in 1939. But its causes can be traced only by looking back to the period around the end of World War I, when the empires that had dominated Central and Eastern Europe disintegrated. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was replaced by a group of small nations too weak to stand on their own. The Russian Empire was replaced by the world's first major communist state. The reaction to these events, as well as to the terms of the peace set by the victorious powers, shaped the future, fostering the rise of fascism and its later conquest of Europe. World War I was still in progress when the Russian Revolution took place. The harsh life of the people had been made unbearable by the war, and early in 1917, a revolution forced the Tsar from the throne. The Russian people wanted an immediate end to the war and drastic social changes to close the enormous gap between the luxurious life of the nobility and the extreme poverty of the mass of the population. But the moderate provisional government that took over from the Tsar failed to fulfill these demands. As discontent spread, the Bolshevik Party, a communist organization, gained increasing support. When the Bolsheviks urged the people to stop fighting the Germans and use their arms in a revolt against the provisional government, the people rallied behind them, and in November 1917, the Bolsheviks, under the leadership of Lenin, took control of the government in the world's first successful communist revolution. The Bolsheviks promised a new kind of society that would eliminate private ownership of land and industry, with a government based on the elected councils of workers, peasants, and soldiers that had sprung up when the Tsar was overthrown. These councils were called Soviets. The new government swiftly signed an agreement with the Germans to end the war, giving up large amounts of territory, including Finland and part of Poland, as the price of a peace settlement. But peace with Germany did not bring peace inside Russia. For 3 years, the Bolsheviks fought a bloody civil war against those who opposed the new regime. The major capitalist powers sent troops to aid the anti-Bolshevik forces. The capitalist nations intervened because they saw communism as a threat to their very existence. The Bolsheviks in Russia had seized factories, businesses, and large landholdings from their private owners, and were urging workers in other countries to follow their example. The Bolsheviks believed that revolutions would soon overthrow all capitalist governments. They envisioned a worldwide federation of Soviet republics that would forever put an end to poverty, nationalist rivalry, imperialism, and war. Pro-Soviet movements grew worldwide. Unrest and revolt were in the air. This was the climate in January 1919, when heads of state gathered at Versailles to settle the terms of peace after World War I. The terms of the peace settlement, along with the tensions caused by the Russian Revolution, became a major factor in setting the stage for World War II. The leaders of the major victorious powers, Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Georges Clemenceau of France, and David Lloyd George of Britain, dominated the debate. What price should the defeated countries pay the victors? How should the map of the world be redrawn? What could be done to prevent a future war? Wilson spoke as leader of the country that during the war had become the world's main financial and industrial center. He hoped to use this position to protect the losers from harsh penalties and to prevent the winners from any large-scale annexation of new territory. Wilson had formulated his ideas into 14 points, including disarmament, an end to secret diplomacy, freedom of the seas, the right of all nations to self-government, and the creation of a League of Nations to settle all future international disputes. The French and British leaders represented people who were still suffering from the death and devastation of the war and were clamoring for revenge against Germany. They either rejected Wilson's points or interpreted them so that they no longer served the intended purpose. For example, the conference acknowledged the principle of self-government in reorganizing the hodgepodge of feuding nationalities that before the war had constituted the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But as the new nations were carved out, many nationalities were left in the position of discontented minorities under governments that did not always represent their interests. Wilson clung most tenaciously to the idea of a League of Nations. He argued for a worldwide organization that specifically included Russia, but, as finally created, the League excluded both Germany and the Soviet Union. When Wilson returned home, he met the worst failure of all. The United States Senate, wanting to isolate the nation from European political controversies, rejected the Versailles Treaty and membership in the League. This headline, announcing the final terms of the peace treaty in June 1919, reflects the dominant spirit of revenge against Germany, even in its use of the derogatory term Huns. Germany was stripped of all its colonial possessions. France and Britain solidified their control of Africa by dividing most of them. Japan got the bulk of Germany's scattered island holdings in the Pacific. The Germans, who had come to Versailles in the belief that the peace treaty would be based on Wilson's 14 points, sat in stunned silence as they heard that their colonies would be taken away, that a war guilt clause placed the entire blame for the war on their shoulders, that they would have to pay huge sums in reparations, that their weapons were to be confiscated and limits placed on the size of their army. Germans at home were outraged. They filled the streets, demanding nothing but the 14 points. They did not believe their country bore sole responsibility for the war and that it should be drained of its wealth and stripped of the power to defend itself. Germany not only lost all its colonies, it lost land in Europe as well. Alsace and Lorraine were returned to France, and other territory was ceded to Belgium and Denmark. East Prussia was separated from the rest of Germany by a strip of land given to Poland. A large area, the Rhineland, was declared a demilitarized zone. One of Hitler's first tests of strength against the Western powers, in this case France, took place here in 1936. And Hitler's decision to reclaim the Polish corridor was the move that finally precipitated World War II.
The birth of Nazism and Hitler's rise to power were both fostered by German reaction to the terms of the peace treaty. Events began to unfold as World War I was coming to an end. In November 1918, with Germany clearly losing the war, a revolutionary movement swept the country. Militant workers, soldiers, and sailors joined together demanding a Soviet form of government similar to the new Russian system. This agitation forced Kaiser Wilhelm II to abdicate the throne and flee the country. German aristocrats and wealthy industrialists who had traditionally held the reins of power were greatly alarmed. Although they had formerly opposed any movement toward parliamentary democracy, now, in the hope of averting a revolution, they quickly sought out and came to terms with Philipp Scheidemann and Friedrich Ebert, leaders of the German Social Democratic Party. While the party was dedicated to socialism and had substantial support among workers, its leaders firmly opposed revolution and were willing to help avert it. On November 9, 1918, they proclaimed formation of a democratic republic, the Weimar Republic, and 2 days later signed an armistice ending World War I. Germany's military leaders struck a bargain with the new government. If the Social Democrats would vow to leave the army in their hands and to suppress the revolutionary movement, the military leaders would support the republic. As revolutionary activity continued, the Social Democrats' leaders, keeping their promise to the generals, called out the army to put down the unrest. In Berlin, hundreds of workers were killed in street battles against combined troops from the regular army and members of the Freikorps, an anti-revolutionary force of former soldiers. In Munich, the Freikorps crushed a communist government which held power for several weeks in 1919 after proclaiming a Soviet republic in the German state of Bavaria. As their more militant leaders were jailed and put to death, many German workers became disillusioned with the Social Democratic leaders of the Weimar Republic. Some protested by supporting the German Communist Party, formed by former Social Democrats. The Weimar government was losing support on all sides. Humiliated by their nation's defeat and suffering under the hardships imposed by the Versailles Treaty, many middle-class Germans blamed the Social Democrats for their plight. They listened with interest to new political groups that advocated a return to pre-war law and order, especially as economic conditions worsened. The value of German currency plunged as the country struggled to make the reparations payments required by the Versailles Treaty. The effects of inflation on the people were staggering. Germans loaded suitcases full of money for a trip to the grocery store, where hardly anything was available. Proud middle-class women resorted to selling empty tin cans. A week's wages could purchase almost nothing. Savings were wiped out. Hunger and panic swept the country. In 1923, when Germany defaulted on a war reparations payment to France, French troops moved in to occupy the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. This caused a new wave of outrage and an upsurge in nationalist feeling. Nationalist sentiment accounted in part for the rapid growth of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, which had been founded in 1920 and used as its symbol the swastika. In November 1923, the Nazi Party took over a political meeting at a Munich beer hall and announced its intention to seize power in Bavaria and then in all of Germany. The Nazi leader was a former corporal in the German army, Adolf Hitler. A spellbinding orator, Hitler preached a blend of avid German nationalism and violent anti-Semitism.
Bleibt das Volk Gib uns 4 Jahre Zeit, dann richte und urteile über uns.
He portrayed the Germans as a master race, the rightful rulers of the world. And he blamed Jews for all of Germany's problems. The party was strongly anti-communist, but included the words workers and socialist in its name in an intentional appeal to the working class. The Nazis' main financial support, however, came from wealthy industrialists who saw the party as a powerful weapon against both the moderate Social Democrats and the more radical communists. Nazi propaganda was effective enough to attract some members of the working class and lower middle class to the ranks of the stormtroopers, the Nazis' paramilitary band. These men, along with former Freikorps members who now wore swastikas, were the troops Hitler counted on when he attempted to take power in Munich. But the time was not ripe. The police were sent to rout the Nazis, killing 16 and causing the leadership to flee. Hitler and his co-defendants were given great publicity during the trial that followed. Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in jail, but sympathetic authorities arranged for his release after 6 months. His first try for power had failed, but his time would come.
Hitler's Munich adventure had been inspired in part by events in Italy, where in October 1922, Benito Mussolini had come to power as head of the Fascist Party, a group quite similar to the Nazis. Before World War I, when Italy was allied with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Mussolini had been a socialist. But during the war, he became a militant nationalist and war advocate. He was expelled from the Italian Socialist Party, which was one of the few in Europe to remain anti-war. Italy had entered the war against its former allies after Britain and France led the country to believe it would get these portions of Austro-Hungarian territory, as well as some share in German and Turkish colonies. But when the peace terms were negotiated, Italy got no colonial territory, and only part of what had been promised in Europe. Ultranationalist former soldiers gave focus to the widespread resentment by occupying the strategic port of Fiume, which had been given to Yugoslavia rather than to Italy. At the same time, Mussolini was organizing former soldiers into small combat squadrons, the Fasci di Combattimento, who came to be known as the Black Shirts. The two ultra-nationalist groups became the backbone of the fascist movement, pledged to wipe out socialism in Italy. Like many other countries in Europe after the war, Italy had a substantial working-class movement sympathetic to the Soviet Revolution, and to the idea that workers should abandon nationalism in favor of an international outlook. Faced with widespread unemployment and inflation, workers in northern Italy seized factories and set up workers' councils patterned on the Russian model. Meanwhile, thousands of peasants took over the large estates that dominated the Italian countryside. Mussolini's fascists, seen by wealthy industrialists and landowners as the only effective barrier to the growing revolutionary movement, received strong financial support. The army and police made no attempt to stop roving fascist bands that attacked Union headquarters and murdered socialist leaders. By 1922, with the power of the unions and the socialists crushed, the fascists felt their hour had come. In October, 30,000 black shirts marched on Rome. The Italian army could easily have turned them back, but King Victor Emmanuel, after some hesitation, decided to avoid a confrontation. He invited Mussolini to become prime minister. At first, Mussolini ruled in coalition with several other parties. But by censoring the press, outlawing unions, and banning opposition parties, he gradually achieved his goal of an all-powerful state, with himself as unquestioned dictator. In Italy, and later in Germany, The state was supposed to control the economy in the interests of all. In both countries, however, industry remained privately owned and operated for profit, while workers were forbidden to form unions or to strike. In place of unions, Mussolini's fascist state organized workers and employers into syndicates, which lauded nationalism and rejected the socialist idea of class conflict. A policy statement declared, "The nation, understood as the supreme synthesis of all the material and spiritual values of the race, stands above individuals, categories, and classes." The combination of intense nationalism and violent opposition to socialism paralleled the Nazi ideology in Germany.
As fascism was on the rise, most people didn't even notice. The world was gradually recovering from the effects of the Great War. People were beginning to enjoy the new pleasures of life in the 20th century. It was the roaring 20s, the jazz age, when the music of American blacks was setting the beat. Women were winning the right to vote in many countries, and generally challenging the limits society had long imposed on them. Traditional morality was being questioned. New ideas filled the air. Writers and artists were looking at the world in strange, exciting new ways. New means of communication, the radio and moving pictures, were creating a new popular culture as millions of people now heard the same music, the same news, and worshiped the same matinee idols. The bitterness of the war years was fading. In a series of diplomatic meetings, the Western powers granted Germany generous loans to help pay off its war debts, and then sharply reduced the debts. In 1925, France, Belgium, and Germany signed a treaty establishing commonly recognized borders. In 1928, all the major powers pledged never again to start a war as they signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact. But the Soviet Union, led at the time by Joseph Stalin, was still not considered part of the world community. The giant USSR was excluded from European deliberations. The optimism of the late 1920s came to a sudden end in the autumn of 1929 when the American stock market crashed. The world's brief period of stability was closely tied to American prosperity. The collapse of the American economy caused a worldwide depression. How the Depression aided the spread of fascism in the 1930s, how militarism gained control of Japan, and how these developments in turn led to war are covered in Part 2. The late 1920s brought prosperity and high hopes for the future to many people in the industrialized nations of Europe and America. But as the Great Depression spread across the world in the 1930s, poverty and unemployment caused millions of people to lose faith in capitalism and democracy, the economic and political systems that prevailed in the highly industrialized countries. Germany, just starting to recover from the burden of war reparations, was especially hard hit by the Depression. As unemployment skyrocketed from 2 million in 1930 to more than 6 million in 1932, Germans turned against the leaders of the Weimar Republic, characterized here as inept and corrupt. More and more people looked to the political parties that promised radical change. In the 1930 elections, this political shift was dramatic. The Social Democrats, depicting the Nazi movement as an autocratic menace, fought hard to retain their position as the nation's largest party. But they lost ground to the Communists, who wanted immediately to do away with the capitalist system of privately owned land and industry. And the Nazis, campaigning on a fiery nationalist platform that emphasized the superiority of the German people, made the most spectacular gains of all. Hitler's rise to power had begun.
In the wake of the 1930 election in Germany, violence became a part of daily life. Pitched battles raged between the Nazis and the Social Democrats and Communists, as Nazi stormtroopers broke up opposition political meetings. Enormous crowds rallied around Hitler, small businessmen, shopkeepers, many of them respectable, upright citizens who wanted law and order, who deeply resented the Treaty of Versailles, and who longed for a return to Germany's days of strength and glory. The strong hand of the Nazi Party would save Germany, Hitler promised, and the public responded. In July 1932, 230 Nazis were elected to the Reichstag, the lower house of Germany's parliament. The Nazis were now the nation's largest political party. Between them, the Social Democrats and Communists had more votes than the Nazis in the Reichstag and were backed by Germany's huge, well-organized trade unions. But the parties could not unite. Although they shared many beliefs, their past disagreements were too bitter. Germany's traditional elite, the aristocracy, the rich industrialists, and the military, now realized that it was impossible for any government to function without the support either of the Communists or of the Nazis. To these conservative leaders, the Communists, whose policy it was to end private ownership of land and industry, were the greater threat. Conservative leaders convinced Germany's president, the leading wartime General von Hindenburg, to appoint Hitler chancellor. Their plan was to control Hitler by surrounding him with their own supporters, while using his popularity with the public to their own advantage. But Hitler had other ideas. As his supporters were cheering his appointment as chancellor on January 30th, 1933, Hitler was already plotting to seize total power. He immediately dissolved the Reichstag and called for new elections. Just before the elections, however, the building that housed Germany's Reichstag went up in flames and was totally destroyed. Although many suspected that the Nazis had set the fire, Hitler blamed communists. He persuaded Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree suspending civil liberties. Communists, as well as many Social Democrats, were arrested and jailed. Hitler strode confidently to open the first meeting of the newly elected Reichstag. With many members of the opposition in jail, it passed a special act under which Germany's elected representatives relinquished their power to Hitler. Even with the Reichstag behind him, Hitler still needed the support of the army. While most military leaders shared Hitler's views, they were wary of the growing power of the stormtroopers, who were challenging the authority of the army. On June 30th, 1934, in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler responded to the military leaders' fears by ordering the execution of hundreds of stormtroopers and troublesome Nazi leaders. The power of the stormtroopers was curbed, and the army was on Hitler's side. Meanwhile, Hitler had begun to coordinate all aspects of German life under Nazi control. All other political parties were abolished. Unions were outlawed. Nazi ministers were appointed to run industries, which, however, remained in private hands and paid profits to their owners. Books that displeased the Nazis were burned in huge bonfires. Independent social and cultural clubs were banned. Churches were placed under government control. Political opponents were arrested. Some were sent to concentration camps. Others were tortured and killed. The Nazis made a special effort to appeal to young people, giving them a prominent role in ceremonies and forming youth groups that were the center of student social and cultural life. Hitler was laying the groundwork for a permanent Nazi Germany, the 1,000-year Reich. In keeping with the racist ideology preached by the Nazis, Jews became a special target for attack. At first, Jewish stores were boycotted, and Jews were excluded from most aspects of German life. Next, Jews by the thousands were arrested and beaten. Later, during the war, the Nazis introduced their final solution to the Jewish problem, as they called it, the total extermination of the Jewish people. By the end of World War II, an estimated 6 million Jews from all over Europe had perished in German concentration camps. Along with the Jews in the death camps were countless others who opposed Nazi rule or did not fit the Nazi image of the master race. One of Hitler's early acts was to embark on a rearmament program, introducing conscription and building a powerful air force, all in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Besides restoring Germany's military might, production of weapons helped pull Germany out of the Depression. The German public was enthusiastic about the new order. Swept up by the pageantry, impressed by the well-disciplined Nazi troops, convinced that their nation's greatness was being restored, Germans confidently joined in singing Deutschland über alles, Germany over all.
As Hitler was consolidating his power at home, he also began moving toward his ultimate goal, world domination. As part of this plan, he allied Germany with Mussolini's Italy and with Japan, another militaristic world. Japan had emerged from World War I greatly strengthened, and by the 1930s was a major industrial power. In the 1920s, it had begun to expand personal liberties and to adopt a Western-style parliamentary government, while keeping a careful balance between Western ways and its own proud culture. Among the traditions that stood fast were the power of the military and the belief that the Emperor Hirohito was divine. Japanese prosperity ended with the worldwide depression, especially after stiff trade barriers were imposed by the United States. Taking advantage of the discontent caused by the Depression, Japanese military leaders embarked on a dual policy of tightening control at home while engaging in a series of imperialist conquests abroad. The personal liberties that had begun to flourish in the 1920s were abolished in the 1930s as the nation became increasingly authoritarian and militaristic. In 1931, Japanese troops invaded Manchuria, a huge Chinese province with abundant resources that promised to ease Japan's economic problems. This attack was the first test of the League of Nations' ability to prevent acts of aggression. With the major powers unwilling to do more than protest mildly, the League was helpless, and Japan felt free to embark on further conquests of Chinese territory. Emboldened by the League's inability to act against Japan, Mussolini sent Italian troops to invade Ethiopia, one of the few independent nations in Africa. Mussolini hoped that the conquest of Ethiopia would be the first step toward building a powerful Italian empire. The Ethiopian Emperor, Haile Selassie, personally appealed to the League of Nations for help. But again, the organization only issued a statement condemning Mussolini's actions. The League could do nothing more, because scolding was as far as Britain and France, its two most powerful members, were prepared to go.
Germany, meanwhile, accelerated its military buildup, which no one had contested, though it plainly violated the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler's next step in 1936 was to send German troops into the Rhineland, which had been declared a demilitarized zone under the Treaty of Versailles. At the time, France's forces were vastly superior and could easily have prevented the move. But Britain and France, remembering their millions who died in World War I, wanted desperately to avoid another war, and again merely protested. Any discussion of the causes of World War II invariably turns to the ins and outs of international diplomacy in the 1930s and to the question, why didn't the other world powers act sooner to oppose fascist aggression? The world from 1936 on was divided into three major power blocks: the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan, the major capitalist democracies, headed by Great Britain, France, and the United States, and the huge communist-led Soviet Union, shunned by all the rest. The Axis power bloc cemented its ties when Germany, Italy, and Japan formally signed an anti-communist pact. A German official defined its purpose. Japan will never permit any dissemination of Bolshevism in the Far East. Germany is creating a bulwark against this pestilence in Central Europe. Finally, Italy will hoist the anti-Bolshevist banner in the South. The leaders of the capitalist countries deplored fascist excesses, but they too saw the Soviet Union as the greater menace. Moscow was the center of an international revolutionary movement. The communists were pledged, at least in theory, to foster the overthrow of capitalism everywhere. The Soviets were deeply worried by the fascist threat, but they were not strong enough to stand up to Hitler alone. Their relations with the Western democracies had been hostile from the beginning, when the Western powers had tried to prevent the Bolsheviks from consolidating their revolution. But in the mid-30s, Soviet leaders made overtures to the democracies to form a common front against Germany. The overtures were rejected. By this time, the Soviet Union was well on its way to transformation from a backward agricultural society to a modern industrialized world power. Stalin was regarded by some in the West as a ruthless dictator. Others believed that with the whole world lined up against him, Stalin had no choice but to maintain the strictest discipline at home. The world at that time did not know the extent of his brutality to his opponents. The Soviet Union's incredible economic progress, lauded in this German poster, drew widespread admiration and convinced many that communism could bring a better life to the millions of unemployed and poverty-stricken people affected by the depression in the capitalist countries. Pro-fascist movements also gained adherents in Britain, France, and other democratic countries, and fights erupted frequently between members of these groups and their opponents. The fear of fascism gave impetus to what became known as the Popular Front movement, a broad alliance of political groups that agreed to set aside their differences in order to combat fascism. Early in 1936, Popular Front governments were elected in France and in Spain. But a few months later, right-wing Spanish generals, under the leadership of Francisco Franco, staged an uprising against Spain's newly elected government. The generals seized control of some parts of the country. But a bloody civil war erupted in much of Spain as people took up arms to resist a military dictatorship. For the next 3 years, Spain was a battleground in the world's ideological struggle. On one side were the armies of the generals, supported by Spain's growing fascist movement, the officialdom of the Catholic Church, and many people of wealth. On the other side were the soldiers of the Popular Front, the alliance of socialists, communists, and liberals, backed by Spain's powerful trade union and anarchist movements. As both sides appealed for outside aid, the conflict became international. Mussolini sent 50,000 troops to aid the generals. Hitler sent the latest weapons, tanks and planes, testing Germany's new tools of war. The Soviet Union was the only major power to send weapons and advisors to aid the Republic, but its contribution was modest and insufficient. The Spanish Republicans had counted on support from their fellow Popular Front government in France, but the French Prime Minister, Léon Blum, was reluctantly pressured to withhold aid. The pressure came mainly from Britain, and also from a powerful bloc of opinion within France itself, which feared the victory of a Russian-style revolutionary movement more than the triumph of fascism. This poster shows France endangered by the flames of communism from the Soviet Union and Spain. Passions ran high in all the democratic nations over the issue of aid to Spain. When the governments of the Western democracies refused to sell weapons to the Spanish government, popular campaigns were launched to collect money, food, and medicine for the Republican Army. Thousands of volunteers poured into Spain from Europe and the United States to help the beleaguered government resist the fascist onslaught. But the combined forces of Franco, Hitler, and Mussolini overpowered the Republicans after 3 years of bitter struggle. Hitler, more confident than ever after the failure of the Western democracies to help the Spanish government, felt free to proceed with one of his long-term plans: to incorporate all the German-speaking territories in Central and Eastern Europe into the German state, a goal that meant annexing Austria and portions of Czechoslovakia and Poland. In March 1938, German troops entered Austria and rapidly occupied the entire country. Austria, one of the weakest nations carved out of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, was the land of Hitler's birth. It had a strong Nazi movement of its own and greeted Hitler as a conquering hero. The next target was a part of Czechoslovakia that contained 3 million German-speaking people, the Sudetenland. In September 1938, the leaders of Britain and France met with German and Italian leaders in Munich. There, with no Czechs present, they agreed to let Germany seize the Sudetenland. This conference came to symbolize the British and French policy of appeasement of fascist aggression, a policy attributed to the desire to avert war and the belief that Germany had been treated too harshly at Versailles, but which the Russians saw as a plot against them. They believed Britain and France were encouraging Hitler to expand eastward toward the Soviet Union, in the hope that Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia would destroy each other. Mussolini and Hitler were quite satisfied with the outcome of the Munich conference. Hitler gained a tremendous military advantage by getting control of the heavily fortified Sudetenland, with its important munitions factories. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, returned home triumphantly, proclaiming that the Munich Agreement had brought peace in our time. He was cheered by the British people who dreaded the prospect of another war. The Czechs, however, felt betrayed, especially by France, which had promised to protect the one nation created by the Treaty of Versailles that had endured as a democracy. Czech feelings were confirmed 5 months later when Hitler broke the Munich Pact by occupying the whole of Czechoslovakia. Finally realizing that Hitler's appetite could not be satisfied by concessions and that the Polish corridor was his next target, Britain and France began preparing for war. They pledged to come to Poland's aid in case of a German invasion, and they began seeking what they had long resisted, an alliance with the Soviet Union against Hitler. But the diplomatic game took a surprising turn. In August 1939, the world learned that Germany and Russia had signed a non-aggression pact in which they agreed not to attack one another and to divide Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe between them. As shocked as the world was by this alliance between two bitter enemies, the strategic reasons for it seemed clear. For Hitler, it meant that Russia would not stand in the way of his planned invasion of Poland, and if war should result, he would not have to fight on two fronts. For Stalin, the pact protected his country, at least temporarily, from German invasion. If war was to come, the Soviet leader preferred to leave it to the Western powers, who for years had refused his attempts to form an anti-Hitler alliance.
And the war did come. On September 1st, 1939, German troops invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. In the spring of 1940, Nazi troops began their sweep across Europe, trampling one country after another. Even France fell in a matter of weeks. Ultimately, the Axis was defeated by the very alliance between Russia and the Western powers that for so long had been so hard to achieve. The world could not keep count of the millions of people who died in battle, in air raids, in concentration camps, in the cities that were wiped out by the atom bomb. The terrifying new weapon that would leave its crippling mark on generations to come.